That's what I gotta do. Okay, cool. So even if you don't end up being like the technical PM or the project manager, you're gonna at some point in managing projects want to figure out how do we, as if I'm working with software teams or if I'm working on a software team, how do we keep track of the stuff that's going on, right? And that's exactly where source code management and like version control come up, right? And so oftentimes, I'll just do a little quick poll. Just give me a thumbs up if you've heard of Git and GitHub before. Even if you haven't used it, you've heard of it before. Like you're like, oh, somebody told me at some point I needed to use this thing, right? Okay, look, it's almost everybody. So yeah, and so really when you start thinking about these tools, the idea is what is it supporting me in doing, right? What is it gonna help me achieve? And so when we think about it, right, oftentimes our first entry point into hearing about Git actually comes from people talking about GitHub, right? People keep saying GitHub, 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 right? And GitHub is an important tool that we use in our teams. There's other tools that do similar things, but the fundamental nature of what GitHub provides us value in actually starts with a tool called Git, which you can download for your computer at this website here, git-scm.com, right? And what Git is a free and open source version control system, right? So let's break down what's that saying. Free and open source, I think we all kind of understand free. That means you don't got to pay for it. Open source, meaning that the code is open for, it's transparent code. So folks have the opportunity to look at the code and contribute to the code in an open fashion as a community. And distributed version control system. So version control is a key word here, right? Version control essentially is referencing the idea that there's different versions of your code at different points in time, right? As you progress in working in your code, there's just different versions that you got to keep track of, right? So maybe you start with one version and you add something and now it's a new version, right? Every time you edit something, you're creating a new version of it, right? And so what Git allows us to do is create a system that manages all of those versions over time so that we have access to them in the future. And we can access the things that we did in the past as well, right? So later, like as you're coding, you might make a mistake and you're like, dang, I wish I had a version. I wish I could go back to the version where I didn't make that mistake. Well, with Git, you're able to do that, right? And so all you're asked to do as an engineer is save your code in those snapshots, essentially, where you want to keep track of those different versions, right? So if you think about it, I like to think about it like when you're playing a video game, you can auto save the game, or you can let's say, I'm not talking about auto save. You can save the game, right? You can checkpoint. You hit a checkpoint, you're like, I bet, I'm gonna go back and save the game. And you save the game. Why? So that if you need to go back, you can go back to that version that you saved. Git is literally working like that. You could take your code and at different moments, you can save it, right? And Git is a great tool, not only for code, but code is just documents, it's text. So if you have anything that's changing in a document-based fashion or in a file fashion, like a file formatting fashion, you can use Git to keep track of it at different versions of its history. So you could use Git to manage updates you're making on a manuscript just as much as things that you might be doing for code. So yeah, it's a great tool. And so I just want to talk about some of the basics and how it connects to GitHub and how it connects in kind of the landscape of what we might be doing, especially kind of for the rest of today. So first thing you need to do is you need to get Git on your computer. So you just go to the git-scm website, download. It should say something based on your operating system. I'm on a Mac, so they have Windows, they have Linux, they have a bunch of other stuff here for you to grab, but you want to download whatever you need for your operating system. After it downloads, you should be able to confirm that it exists by opening up. If you're on a Mac, you can open up your terminal, or if you're on Windows, you can open up your command prompt. But Git on a Mac, on a Windows machine, actually installs another program called Git Bash which is an app that you can use as well. It's actually, you could use the Git bash to test your Git commands and stuff like that. But either way, you need to open either a terminal, the command prompt, or your Git bash application. And the simple thing that you want to do to check to see if you have Git installed on your computer, this works for any software too. If you want to check if you have specific framework or package installed on your computer, you know what the command is, right? So in Git, the command for the package for Git is just Git, right? So if you know what the package name is, then you could type the name of the package and then something like -- help. And that should show up a menu that should give you some information on the particular package or command, right? So Git is showing me back like some helpful stuff here. If it didn't say, if I didn't have it installed, it would tell me, oh, we can't recognize this command. And another command you can use to check if you have, what version you're running is git -- version. So I'm running version 2.3. You can see that the latest is 2.37. I don't have the latest right now. And just for the purpose of what we're getting into, it doesn't matter if you don't have the latest. But if you did want to get the latest release, you would just have to click the download button here or update it on your local machine. Anything over version 2, so long as you're not on like version 1 or something crazy, I think we're good here. Leah, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, so I'm not sure if it's just me. I don't think it is because somebody said in the chat, we can't see the screen you're currently sharing.
Oh, interesting. That's not cool. Let me see.
First of all, what are you sharing, Professor?
I was sharing the terminal.
No, we couldn't see it.
Oh, that's my bad, y'all. I don't know what to tell y'all. Interesting. Wild. It's wild how these things work, huh? Yeah, it should share it. I had it on my whole desktop. Y'all can't see it now either? No?
No, we could see the Slack window.
You have to click the window that you want to share.
The Slack window. No. Don't get me wrong, bro. Don't tweak on me.
On the Zoom. You have to
on the Zoom. You gotta click.
You have to select the Zoom.
No, I did. No, I swear I did. No, don't tweak on me, y'all. I'm not one of those. I'm not one of those old school dudes that don't know what I'm clicking on. I'm clicking on it. I think the issue is just my monitor.
Low-key might not let you just like share your terminal. Like it doesn't show it.
No, bro.
You can. Previous professors have.
I think it's a monitor thing. Can you see it? Can you see it now? If I go here, can you hear me?
We see you.
We just see you.
Oh, that's my bad. I'm just not sharing at all. That's my bad.
Oh, now
we see it.
Yeah.
Cool. You're welcome. No, I appreciate that. Thanks for that. Yeah, that sucks. I can't use my other monitor, but it's okay. So all I was saying is if you want to check to see if you have a specific software on your computer, you need to know the command to run that particular piece of thing. So with Git, the command to run Git commands on your terminal is Git. So you could do Git -- help, which will pop up with something to show you that you have the command installed. If the command's not installed, so like let's say I type like git help, right? It'll say something like command not found, which means that it doesn't have anything that recognizes that thing, right? So so long as you could type git -- help and see something, or you could type git -- version and see something that kind of comes back with your version number, you're good to go. That's really all you need to know that you have Git installed. So because I don't know how far back that didn't work, so just go to the git -scm website. You can click download and it'll download based on whatever your operating system is. And then you can use the command line to check to make sure you have it installed. On Windows, it'll also install another program called Git Bash that you can use as well. So cool. If that makes sense, just give me a thumbs up so I know that we're on the same page. Thanks, Lee. I appreciate that. And the good folks in the chat. Appreciate y'all. Okay, cool. So you have Git installed on your computer. That's step one. Step two is you got to start creating some code that you want to manage, right? And this is the part where a lot of people kind of, a lot of things get a little bit interesting for folks. Like, this is where I think folks think that it gets a little challenging. But the majority of what you want to achieve, right, is that you have some projects that you're going to be working on, right? You and your team, you're going to be working on certain things, right? So let's say, for instance, I'm just going to go to a clean folder on my computer where I can demonstrate this. And let's say me and my team are working on a new web project, and it's called like Awesome Website or something, right? Well, I might, first of all, let's say they tasked me out with like creating the first, organizing the code. Like, they're saying, okay, we're going to create the files that we're going to use to write our code. Cam, could you take the lead on it, right? Maybe my director tells me, hey, you're going to take the lead on just writing the repo, or they do it, right? And they're going to tell me later that they made the files and whatever. Either way, somebody, what do we use to keep track of our files? We use a folder, right? So it's very common that you'll create a folder for whatever it is that you're working on, right? So let's say Awesome Website. So now I have a folder, right? And this is really important. It seems very simple, but oftentimes I feel like, especially for students, folks that are first using Git, you don't remember to do this, but you need a folder for the projects you're working on. Certain libraries will create folders for you, but you want to make sure you have a folder just to store and organize your code the right way. And here's the reason why. Git will track things within specific folders, and you can tell Git which folder do you want it to look into. So if you don't specify a folder, it might look at your whole computer as the folder of your whole like home drive. You don't want all those files to be tracked. You want the specific ones for your project, right? So in this case, in this folder, it's empty. So there's nothing in there. But let's say we're working on a project, right? Like, maybe we're working on a very simple website. And so we might have like an index.html file in there. We might have like a styles, that CSS file in there. And we might even have a JavaScript file if we're getting really into it, right? And so all three of those files are now in this folder, right? And so, the point is that you start off with certain files, and every bit of files that you're working in are going to change over time, right? So right now I have this state where I have the files, I have the folder, everything's where it needs to be, but I need to start writing the code. This might be a great opportunity for me to start the process of tracking this folder with Git, right? So how will I do that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize a repository in this folder. So a repository basically is a big word to me that means like a bucket for the code that you're tracking over time, right? So to initialize a repository, I have to use the git command, and I say git init, right? And git init is going to create an empty repository in this specific folder, right? That's why I'm saying it's very important that you have your code that you want to keep in Git in a particular folder. So initialize an empty Git repository. So now I have that. Now I have Git working to like keep track of things going on inside of this folder. And the tool you want to use to check if Git is if you're using Git inside of a folder is Git Status. So Git Status will tell you what branch are you on. We'll talk about that in a second. What commits are you making? And then which files are being tracked, meaning which files are being kept up to date in the version control system. So clearly we see those three files I just created, and it's red, which basically means that they're not being tracked right now. It says there's nothing added to commit, but untracked files present, use git add to track, right? So it's a very simple workflow for keeping up to date the files that you want to track. That part of using Git is very simple. So in order to do that, all you have to remember is first you need to, first you have the files, then you make some changes, and then here's the steps you do all the time. You add the files that you want to track. You commit the files that you want to track to basically it's almost like you're saving a new snapshot at that moment with those committed files, right? And then depending on what you want to do next, like if you've already added it, you've already committed it, you've done literally everything you need to do technically. But if you want to be safe for good measure, you might say, oh, let me save this somewhere else just in case, right? And that's pushing the files. That's what the push is doing. So add the files, commit the files, and maybe you push the files. But adding and committing is the process, right? So, and I'll show you why, right? So we have these three files, this index.html, this index.js, and styles.css, right? So my job as a web developer, right? If I'm working on this team, I'm the front end developer on the team, and they're like, hey, Cam, we need you to create that website, and then so-and-so is going to create the back end and all that other stuff. So they're working on something else, right? So, okay, cool. I'm responsible for these files. All right, bet. So first thing I'm going to want to do is edit the files, right? That's why you want to have a text editor on your computer. You could use Atom, you could use Sublime Text, you could use VS Code. Personally, I use VS Code. And so with VS Code then is where I would be spending my time writing out the code that I want to change, right? You can also use an inline text editor. I just want to mention that too, right? There's a couple built into your operating system like Nano on a Mac, on Linux-based operating systems and stuff like that. I don't know if Nano works on Windows. If it does, holler me in the chat. That'd be cool to know. But there's a couple things you could use in your terminal, just in the terminal. But most of us are going to use some text editor, right? So VS Code is my text editor of choice. Of course, it's going to open real quick. And so basically what I want to do with the text editor is I want to open these files, or like this folder that I just created, right? This awesome website folder that has a couple files inside of there. So in the whoops, let me just open a new window. So in the in VS Code, right? Like I can open a new window to a specific folder, a specific project, right? So I'm going to open a folder and I'm going to look for that particular folder that I created, right? Which was called awesome. It was called awesome website, right? It was in my temp folder, right? So here's the folder. So this is the same process you might do. You want to find the folder that represents the code that you're just about to edit, right? That you just added to Git. And so whether you're using VS Code, Sublime, or any of those other tools, it's the same process. Open the folder that has the particular code that you're looking for. So here on the left-hand side on VS Code, you get to see all the files. Most text editors are built the same way. You see all the files. If you have a folder, a corresponding folder, you'll see that there's a top level thing that signifies the folder, but here's all those files, right? And again, all of them are blank. There's nothing inside of them. So like I was mentioning, this might be a great time for us to take our first snapshot of the code because it's the state where everything is empty. There's nothing else. You know, we could say this is where we're initializing things. So again, what do? Well, I want to add the files. There's a couple different ways you can do this, but I'll show you the ones that we use often. So you can use git space add space dot, and this dot will basically say, add all of the files that are present in this folder, right? So that's just a shortcut to say, let me add all three of these files. If I didn't want to do that, I could also add a file directly by typing in the name of the file. So if I did git add index.html and I ran git status again, I'll see that I have this new file being tracked, right? So remember, in order for me to keep record of these files, I need to have them being tracked over time. So to save some time, I'm just going to do git add dot, which is going to make it so that all three of those files are being tracked now and they're part of the history, right? So why is this important? Well, now that I'm tracking these files, I can commit them to the version control. So typically the command for commits is git commit -m and then open in some quotation marks, and inside of the quotation marks you want to put a little message that's going to help you remember what happened at this particular moment in the code. I'll show you why that's important in a second. So this particular message, right, what it is signifying is, well, this is just our initial, I have to make sure I spelled that right. This is our initial commit, right? So I'm just saving a record right now to say, hey, this is us when we had nothing in the files. This is exactly just that. Every time you add files and commit them, you get what's called a log of those commits. So if I run the command git log, I can see a commit with a specific hash that is unique to that commit. And it tells me what branch it was on. It tells me who was the author, tells me what time it happened, and it tells me that message that I just wrote, which is why it's important to leave a very helpful message. Like leaving a message that says committed or something, like it doesn't help you, because I mean, eventually you're going to have a bunch of commits like this, and you're going to want to know which one am I trying to reference when I'm looking for something, right? So that's the process of what Git does, right? You can write your files, you can add them, you can add your files to get committed, and you can commit them, right? And then the valuable thing about Git is it's storing these values over time. So right now, remember, the version that we're just committed is empty. So normally we don't stay that way too long, right? I might go into, let's just do the JavaScript one for right now, just to keep it simple for myself. And I might say, okay, cool, I want to just write a couple lines of JavaScript, you know what I'm saying? I might just do like a console log, which is the way you print in JavaScript, and say, hello world, right? And so if I save this now, right, this is just me referencing like the file's different at this point. So if I go back to my terminal, right, and I type in Git status one more time, well, because Git is watching these files in the folder, it's going to tell me, hey, you modified this folder, or you modified this file, excuse me. And so now it's like, oh, you've modified this. If I got rid of it and saved it again, it'll show that it's not modified, right? If I just delete this and save this and then go back to the terminal, right, and Git status, right? It knows that change, it knows what the current state of the file is, which is what makes this very significant when the file gets very complicated over time. But let's say we did want to keep that change, right? Let's say we did want to keep this. Well, you're now responsible for asking yourself, okay, as I'm making this change, what do I want to do? Do I want to commit it, right? Like, is this something that I want to save a record of? And maybe you're like, oh, well, maybe I want to add a couple other things in the into the HTML file. Maybe I want to add like a default HTML kind of system, or like just a little HTML code in there. Right. And it looks something like this. Right. And so this is like a default, I'm sorry, this is so small, my bad. This is like a default HTML file, right? It has kind of like the structure of a regular HTML file. And maybe I want to save that, right? And then maybe I'm like, oh, you know, I also want to just kind of, you know, give this little H1 an ID and say message, right? And then to connect some CSS, maybe I'm saying, okay, hey, find the element with the ID called message. This is just a little bit of CSS for y'all. And then just like, you know, maybe I want to just change the font size, or maybe I just want to change the color or something, and just make it black or something, right? So so now I have, like, not only do I have an HTML file in here, I have some CSS, I have some JavaScript. It's not all the way connected the way it needs to be. I need to bring in that CSS file to the HTML if I really want that to show up the right way. But for the sake of the example, let's say I added these different files, I'm adding things to them. Well, over time, right, now might be a good point where I'm like, oh, you know, I do want to save this version because this is representing a solid example for me. So what I might do now is, like I said before, we're going to do git add, right? We're going to add the files. Every time you add them, if you run git status, you'll see that they go from not being tracked to now being tracked, right? So then after you add, you want to commit. So I'm going to create a different commit message here. And I'm going to say added boilerplate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code and JavaScript. And now, right, if I do git log one more time, I see I have both of those commits, right? I have the commit I just did, added boilerplate, and I have the commit from before, right? And so why Git is important is over time, you might want to go back to some of these versions, right? And you can do that very easily because you've stored this commit hash in there, right? So ultimately, what Git is allowing you to do is store this local kind of repository of code that says, here's where my code is at in these different moments of time, right? So if that part of what we're talking about makes sense to you, just give me a thumbs up real quick so I can, so I know we're on the same page. Cool, I appreciate y'all. Thanks for those of y'all who are doing that. It's helpful. Thank you. Okay, so that's the core of what Git is doing. It's essentially it's documenting our code in different moments over time, right? And so the next logical question is, okay, well, I'm glad I'm storing this on my computer, but what happens if something happens to my computer? If my computer suddenly the hard drive messes up or something, like, God forbid, now I'm kind of, just like any other file on my computer, this can get lost, right? So one of the valuable things of recent times, like innovations wise, is the value of the cloud computing, right? And cloud computing has basically allowed for us to create opportunities to leverage computers that run not on our own local machine, but outside in different servers and whatnot. And so we're able to use the cloud to keep track of things that we want to preserve longer time, because it won't happen on just one machine. We can have it scale out to as many machines as we want. So what people normally do, and think about it for yourself, when you have an important picture that you care about on your phone and you're like, oh, I want to save this, but I don't want to have it on this device. What do? You save it to the cloud, right? It's the same thing with our code. We're not going to just want to keep it local, because if something happens, that messes it up. So for extra protection, one value, for extra protection, it might make sense to save it somewhere that's cloud-based, that will hold it for us and we can reference it whenever we want to, right? That is what GitHub is doing for us. GitHub is allowing us to save our repositories, our Git repositories, to the cloud. And it allows us to do that by allowing us the opportunity to create repositories, right? And each repository that you create in GitHub has to have a corresponding project with Git attached to it, right? And so the way that you create a repository, you would go to GitHub, create an account, and then make sure that you authenticate with GitHub so that you can leverage the resources there, and then create a new repository on GitHub as the cloud. Like this is the cloud representation of the thing we have locally. So I'm just gonna give it the same website or the same name. I'm gonna call it Awesome Website, and this is here in the cloud, right? I'm gonna just say a sample repo for my dope students. I love y'all. Yeah, so we can create it. That's all we really need. We just need the name, and I leave a description sometimes, but that's really all you really need is the name. And once you have that, you can create the repository. And it gives you some commands that you need to use to connect the local repository to this cloud-based repository. The most important of them, I always have a grievance with this screen on GitHub because it doesn't really show you what happens in the case that you have something in between. But essentially, it kind of shows you some of those same steps that we did, right? So here it says, create a new file called README. So this is saying, hey, if you want to create a new repository on the command line, you need to have some files you want to commit. Git init was the command we used earlier to create that repository. Add, remember I said we can add specific files. So what they're doing in this line is creating a file called README, and then they're initializing Git like we did, adding that particular file, and then they do their commit and whatnot. They also have a couple other commands here. This command renames the master branch to be called main. GitHub just does that for political reasons that we could talk about a different time. But ultimately you see that we did the add and we did the commit, which were the two most important pieces. The last piece, if you want to actually have the value of saving your local repository that we were just talking about into the cloud, you need to do this important step right here, which is git remote add something, right? And so git remote is a method in Git, command in Git, that basically says add a remote like link to a repository that's stored remotely from this machine. So we have the local one, which is on our computer right now, but I want to store a remote one, right? To kind of keep up with that same repository. That's what this line of code is doing. So what I have to do is go back to the terminal into my project folder where I've been doing all this work. And I want to add that line in there, git remote add origin. And if I do the command git remote -v, you'll see that that alias origin is tied to this particular link. So this command git remote add blah, blah, blah takes in two parameters. One is called an alias that you can name this whatever you want. You just got to remember what you name it. And you have one that is the actual path to the repository remotely that you're kind of communicating with. And by adding a new link to the remote, right, you get to see that that particular link now can be referenced with this alias called origin. And it allows us to do two things, fetch and push, right? Fetch is kind of like what it describes is bringing something to us. Push is pushing something away or pushing something up, right? So when we push, we're pushing to something, right? And when we fetch, we're pulling from something. So this is basically saying we've attached this alias to this particular remote repository, and we're able now to pull from it, and we're able to push to it. So remember, I was saying that first, the three kind of things you do often, especially if you're working in a project that's going to use Git and GitHub, you're going to be making files. You're going to be adding the files you want to keep track of, committing those files into specific snapshots, and then pushing them when you're ready to put them into the remote repository. So right now, like y'all saw, I have 2 commits that I've done locally. I can make as many commits as I want locally, but then when I'm ready to put those commits up to the cloud, all I have to do is run the command git push origin. Right now, because my branch is named, matter of fact, let me just do this command so that it's up to date with what GitHub is saying. But we'll just run this git branch -m command so that it'll just change. If you remember a couple ways ago, we were doing Git Status and it was saying on branch master. This command git branch -M main changes the name of that branch to be called main. So if I do Git Status now, it just says I'm on branch main, which is fine. But the most important thing to connect your local repository to GitHub is to run this last command, git push -u origin, blah, blah, blah. And that is going to, so long as everything's connected the right way, right, it's going to run some code that's going to push these things together. Before I refresh and show you that this worked, I just want to note that you don't have to do this line every time you make a new repository. All you need to do is make sure you have some code already in there, and you've initialized Git, and you've added and committed whatever you want to add and commit. That's why I'm saying this screen gives me a little bit of grievances sometimes. But after you've added your own, like all of these steps, let's say like this, all of these steps are on your local machine, right? Oh, all these commands happen on your local machine, but everything up to here is just you storing local commits in your local machine. But once you start getting into this and adding a remote and pushing, you're pushing to a remote machine. So that's just important to know what's happening locally and then what's happening remotely. Only the push is going to do something with GitHub. That's, I guess, what you should keep in mind. Like everything else is on your local computer. Until you push, it's not on GitHub, right? But once you push, then you can refresh and you'll see that now that same folder of code that we were talking about is stored here on GitHub for me to access, right? And I can take a look. I can see that HTML file based on what we edited, but I also see the commits and I can visualize these commits now on the cloud, right? So here I can see the 2 commits that we had and whoops, I can see the 2 commits that we have. And if I go back to the initial one, I can also view the files at that particular moment. And I'll see that initially it was empty, right? But then over time, we added the stuff we needed to add. So that's what makes GitHub helpful, is now I can have a cloud, I can store this in the cloud to keep track of it longer term. And that's what makes it helpful. The other thing it does that is helpful is it'll, now that I have it in the cloud, right? Now that it's not in just my local machine, more people can access it now, which allows for collaboration to take place. So we use GitHub also to facilitate collaboration at this stage. Now that you have your code up, and maybe your manager does all of this and you don't think about it because you're like, oh, you know, like somebody, I'm working at a company that has had a repo for the longest time. You might not end up creating repos, but this is what they did to get the repository up, get the commits going. There's all these other aspects of it that we could touch on, but I don't want to run out of time on that. But essentially, the most important thing after this is that, yeah, now that you have a remote repository set up, now you can invite collaborators, and you can do that in GitHub via the settings, right? You can say, hey, you know, I want to add a couple, I want to add a couple folks to my repository to collaborate with me, right? And so on GitHub, it makes it very simple. You could just say, hey, you know, I want to add some people to the repo. So long as you know their username, right, you can add them, or their email, you can add them to collaborate on your particular project. And you all can start making changes to this exact same repo on the cloud, right? So typically what will happen is, instead of it being your personal and this like kind of thing, unless you're working on a personal project, if you're working on a professional project, this will be your organization, and this will be the organization's repo, and they'll add you as a collaborator. And as a collaborator, they'll give you certain permissions for what you can do as a collaborator. Most times, if you are an employee, they'll give you read and write access, right? And read and write access will allow you then to go back here and then say, hey, you know, I'm a collaborator, so I can push to this particular remote repository as well as pull from it. One thing to just say lastly about how GitHub works is any repo on GitHub that you have access to see, if you could see it on GitHub, you have access to pull it down. You can download it, right? So sometimes people will make private repos for that reason. For the sake of what we're doing in class, you don't have to feel like your stuff is going to be too crazy that you have to put it private. In fact, it makes it harder, because if it's private, then you have to keep sharing stuff. But when it's public, folks can see, collaborate. It creates a better open source culture that way. But a company, for obvious reasons, wouldn't want to do that, right? So they'll use private repos, or they'll use different tools to keep their stuff a little bit more secure. But if you are trying to just take a look at some code, right, you can always go and download or copy the command to clone a repository. And I talk about that in a different video. But cloning and like basically getting a copy of that repository is as simple as basically taking that link and then going to wherever it is on your website, on your home computer that you want to save that file. So let's say I just want to save this to my downloads. Then I want to just do the command git clone with this link. And that is going to clone into that repo, which is what me as a collaborator, I have to do, is clone into that repo. So now when I go into that folder, right, I have access to those files, right? If I'm a collaborator, I can then, I'll be able to see that this was connected to this particular GitHub remote repo. And if I'm a collaborator, I'll be able to then do my git adds, git commit, and then ultimately my git push. But if I'm not a collaborator, I won't be able to push because I don't have access to this cloud repo, right? So if you're trying to collaborate with teams, you got to make sure not only do you start the process of creating your boilerplate repository, pushing it to GitHub, making sure you add them as collaborators. Then as the collaborator, you get to download or clone the repo that you were trying to take a look at. And then you can start collaborating more effectively on GitHub. But like I said, I get into that in a different video. So definitely want y'all to take a look at that on your off time. yeah, this is just a quick primer into like what is Git and like how we use it, why is it important, and then how it connects to GitHub, and also how it connects to kind of like VS Code or whatever IDE you're using to make your code, whether it's Eclipse or whatever. So yeah, so just quick show of thumbs if this is all making sense to you. Just give me a quick thumbs up so I know we rocking. Appreciate that, and appreciate the folks who are going to watch this on YouTube later and ask a million questions. But if you have a question